1976. It was actually
Sean, we are now recording, so let me just say, everybody, welcome back to American Lit. America is a mixtape class with Mr. Smith at Tennessee Tech Spring 2022, and our guest today is Sean Maloney, and he is the author of a 33 1/3 book about the modern lovers that came out about 5 years ago. He's dialing in from Massachusetts this morning. He's home with his wonderful son Seamus, who might make an appearance. Anyway, Sean, so we had just read, you were just telling us the brief lineage of the record, but then we're going to get into your lineage, because I think that's something that I really want you to share your story with our class. But tell us what we just heard really briefly. So we just listened to the opening track, Roadrunner, from the album that you made it's kind of like a life project now.
Yeah. You know, it was it's a really interesting album because it's hugely influential. It was huge. Seamus, please be quiet. That, you know, children of punk rockers, they're always screaming. So anyways, Modern Lovers had like a huge influence on the very first British punks. When this album was reissued or issued for the first time in the UK, it became like a jukebox staple amongst like folks like The Clash and the Sex Pistols and, you know, the Buzzcocks and all those kind of like early UK punk bands. And here in the US, while the Modern Lovers never really made a huge splash as a band, they each of the members would do important things. Jerry Harrison would go on to be a member of the Talking Heads, in kind of like the second incarnation after they had made their like debut. And then David Robinson, the drummer, would go on to drum for DMZ and The Cars, who some of you might know from classic rock radio. And all of those bands kind of, you know, had like more impact and more fans than the Modern Lovers ever did. But the Modern Lovers have just been kind of like a consistently loved cult outfit since the very beginning. You know, like they never went on tour, they never headlined a show outside of their hometown, outside of small DIY efforts. You know, they never recorded a proper album. All of these recordings were done with John Cale and Kim Fowley and Matt from their eventual label, but they were never intended for release. But they were so good, and so there was so much energy in them that even after the band had broken up and, you know, gone off to do other things, people were still interested. You know, they were an early tape trading band. You know, people that had the demo tapes would pass them off to their friends, and so they had this, you know, this cult. I mean, it helped that like Jonathan Richman, the singer for the Modern Lovers, was one of the very first Velvet Underground fans. He was the very first Velvet Underground super fan. He claims to have seen them something like 75 times, which is like a huge chunk of their, you know, of their performances, relatively speaking. And so, you know, the Modern Lovers were connected with that very earliest wave of proto-punk in the US, built around, there's this woman named Lillian Roxon, grand dame of rock criticism. She was the one that published Danny Field's article about where they found John Lennon's quote about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, that started off that whole like phenomenon. Lillian and Danny would kind of like set the aesthetic tone for what would become punk rock. Lillian doesn't get as much credit these days as she should, mostly because she never wrote for any of the rock magazines. She was a professional writer. She was syndicated. She was international, and she died young. She wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Rock that kind of, you know, it canonized the Velvet Underground and the Modern Lovers and the Shangri-Las in this kind of like cohesive framework that doesn't get the credit it deserves as like an apocryphal kind of book. So Lillian and Danny Fields both had a soft spot for like cute boys that played really loud music. Danny Fields would, he would sign the MC5 and the Stooges, and he would go on to manage the Ramones. And so and he was like, I don't know, Danny Fields is like the glue that holds American 20th century music together, or the last half of it anyways. He was an A&R guy for Elektra Records. He was the one that brought in David Peel, who wrote this. It now seems like really kind of silly and goofy, and at the time it was definitely a parody record, but it's a really important parody record called Have a Marijuana. And it was one of like the first popular American records to go on record in favor of marijuana use. So like the entire category of stoner music starts with this record that Danny Field put together with a folk singer from Union Square. So that's what Danny's doing. And then Lillian has this huge network of papers that she's writing for with a huge audience. She is the pop critic. She was one of the very first people in a major newspaper to be focused on kind of the evolution of rock and the emergence of rock as kind of its own form in the mid to late 60s. And so, and she was totally sweet on Jonathan Richman, who was, just like this weirdo that liked to play one chord songs. And, like there's a great quote from Steven Tyler of Aerosmith where, like I had never seen anybody like that. He couldn't sing a note and he played for 19 minutes on one chord and it was amazing. So like Jonathan was kind of this like weird outlier in a very, in Boston music at the time and in, rock in general, because it was a very Rococo era in music. You had a lot of, we don't hear a lot of it now, but the kind of flood of psychedelic rock that happened in the 1960s was a very maximalist time for music writing and creativity, and all of these like young folks that were making these new records and aiming for new sounds were just throwing everything and the kitchen sink and somebody else's kitchen sink, and just like these really ornate, complex records with lots of like classical music influence and folk music influence, and Jonathan Richman like loved the Loving Spoonful and the Velvet Underground, and he stripped everything down to just these two chords that you hear in Roadrunner, and it caught the right ears. It didn't catch everybody's ears. It didn't catch a lot of it didn't get any radio airplay. It didn't, they never had a hit record. They didn't even have a record. But, those tapes mattered enough to enough people that they eventually manifested as a classic record. And, it's been 50 years since those recordings were made, and they still sound like absolutely incredible. Which is, a lot of that has to do with like having John Cale of the Velvet Underground, behind the board, because that dude just had an incredible ear.
So Sean, you're too young. You're too young to know anything about this, and you just like are like opened up this encyclopedia of like knowledge and wisdom about this. Is that a Dunkin' Donuts? That you Northeasterners are so weird with your Dunkin' Donuts.
Oh man, it's my absolute least favorite coffee in the world. But like the woman that works like after I drop him off at daycare is really nice, and it's just like easy to like go through the line. And so now I drink Dunkin', not because I enjoy it, but because that's what we do in Boston. Is we drink.
Here, I mean, we're part of, even though this is far, Cookeville is about as far away from Seattle as you can get. We have 2 Starbucks in Cookeville now, and they're always crowded. And then we have like 5 like local coffee shops and
oh, that's amazing.
In Cookeville. Okay, so help us figure out though how you get the bug and where this fits. And I want you to talk more generally about how you get the bug for rock and roll as a serious art form and as a calling and a vocation. As somebody who's not in a band, like myself, I'm not in a band, but I've had the similar obsession as you my whole life. So how do you get the bug, and then how does this fit in with you getting the bug? This record that is at least a generation. So you're discovering this album at least 20 years probably after this was happening. So
yeah, I first found out about this record in probably what I think it was 1995. So I was 16. I had like, at the time there was a great commercial alternative radio station in Boston named WFNX that did like a pretty solid job of like playing like classics and like local stuff. They had a great local show every weekend, and I was obsessed with it. It was like up until like I got really into college radio. It was all I listened to. Like all of the DJs begrudgingly talked to me. Like they all knew who I was because I would call once a day part, and so I don't know. There was just like there was a day where I heard it and I was listening to this song, and it's talking about Massachusetts. That's where I live. It's talking about 128, which is the road, the major highway like down the street from me. It's talking about just like being lonely and listening to the radio and all of that kind of like teenage yearning. And it just clicked, and I made it a mission to find a copy of the CD, which had been out of print for almost 10 years at that point. But I found it. And then it was just kind of, that was like the record. I was already obsessed with the Velvet Underground. And then, I got this one CD, and it just like opened up this whole world of, now that I think about it, like this whole world of like a place where I lived. But, I think finding, music that is about, who you are and where you're from, that discovery, knowing that because the town that I'm from it's an exit off the highway with very little in the way of culture. Like it had a CD store, but nobody bought CDs there. The comic book store, closed in like a year. It was it's just kind of like a cultural void. It's our claim to fame for a long time was that like Aerosmith played a house party there in the 70s. And that was all. That was it. That was the only like rock and roll in town. So to hear this dude singing about the same highway that I drive in the middle of the night, coming back from shows or going to shows, it was kind of world changing. And then there's other songs on the record that are like talks about he has a song called The Modern World when he talks about like Boston University and hanging out on Calm Ave and going, he mentions a lot of like geographic locations that were part of my, just part of my world. And, like he has this classic line, if I went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I would go to the room where they keep the Cezannes and I would look through the paintings. And then that like struck me because like I was studying art in the city, and I went to the Museum of Fine Arts all the time, and I knew where they kept the Cezannes, and I was like, oh, wait a second. I get that like you can understand things from a geographic location. You know, like things will make sense. Art exists in a space. I think that when I was young and didn't really have any contact with art as like as a kid in an artless town, the idea that art would make sense was kind of like, mind blowing, and that you could understand art based on where you were. That sort of like that opened up everything. I mean, that's why, it's like in fine wine, they talk about terroir, which is the taste of the place. It's the minerals and the flavors that come up through the roots and grow into the fruit and become, the specialness that you're drinking. And this album was kind of like where I realized that music has terroir. Like the growing up in the suburbs of Massachusetts is going to give you a very different, approach to how you see art versus like, growing up in downtown New York. I have friends that like grew up on the Lower East Side, and they have a very different perspective on how art interacts with life than I do.
So Sean, I'm on the school bus in the Detroit suburbs, and I'm listening at this. I'm like 14 or 15 or 16, listening to like Bob Seger. And I didn't know, and that to me was Detroit. I had never heard of MC5 and Stooges yet. And I was literally a couple seats away from Dave Strotter, who was the lead singer of Majesty Crush and Spawn Ranch, who's now sadly dead. But like an underground Detroit legend was on the same bus as me. And I had no clue. So this 50 minutes is flying by way too fast. So I want a little bit of your career arc. So what is the Massachusetts to Murfreesboro to Nashville arc? What is that? How do you end up being this, teenager listening to the alternative radio station? How do you get from there to Murfreesboro, Tennessee? Give us, and then how do you find your calling into writing? Because you have quite a nice career arc as a journalist. So, and I didn't, just keep in mind, they just had Mark, and Mark was like MTV, Rolling Stone. I mean, so they understand, like, think they're starting to get a sense, and I've at least referenced Lester Bangs once in the class. So they're starting to get a sense of this idea of the professional music fan writer thing. But tell us about how you ended up going from Massachusetts to Murfreesboro, of all places.
So I had dropped out of school in 2001, and I was, the economy was rosy. I didn't really feel like I was, doing what I wanted. So I was taking some time off from school. And then September 11th happened. I got laid off that day. A few months later, I got laid off from my other job because that store shut down. And I was just like, well, and then I went to this other store. I was the manager of, I don't know if anybody watches The Simpsons, but there's an episode where Ned Flanders opens up the Leftorium, the left-handed store. That is based on a store that was in Boston that I was the manager of. And when the Leftorium closed and I was set adrift, I'm also right-handed. It was a weird gig. But so when the Leftorium closed and when we were planning on like shutting that business down, I decided I was gonna go back to school. And I decided I was gonna study the music business because at a magnetic field show in 1997, I met the opening band who were from Nashville, and we had talked, and one of their members mentioned that he was studying the music business in Nashville. He went to school there, and And years later, I remembered this conversation, and I was like, oh, well, I'll go to Nashville and study the music business. And because because Belmont is so expensive. Yeah, you want to talk about skeletons? Different band. Grateful Dead is tomorrow. Anyways, so like I just, and while I was applying, the band Against Me, okay, little anarchist. Yeah, so Against Me, the anarchist band from Florida, had stayed on my couch in Boston. And we're having a conversation, and my roommate mentions that I'm applying to schools down here. And the bassist, Andrew Seward, goes, oh, yeah, I graduated from there. Here, let me make a place of people to talk to and burritos to eat. And so like immediately when I got to Murfreesboro, I had this crew of like super creative people, and we immediately just kind of started making all sorts of art. I mean, I was in bands. We opened a record label and a record store, and we were making posters, and we were doing, excuse me, everybody meet Spider-Man. Welcome to the Spider-Verse. I'd like you to introduce you to Miles Morales, my partner in crime. Okay. So basically when I finished school and I got my first like corporate job, my timing was terrible again, and it was the but can you take Spider-Man over there? So just by like chance, I knew the music editor at the Nashville scene, and I was out of school and I was looking for something to do while I had this corporate gig going, which was like really boring. And so I started writing blurbs for the Nashville scene and for the all weeklies. And after that, Seamus, don't jump on the balloon. That'll be disastrous. And then the global economy collapsed, and I ran out of like corporate job, and I had all this time on my hand, which is really all you need to make a writing career happen, is enough time to like actually write. And so I started cranking out copy, and it went from just like writing for the weekly to writing for a couple of monthly music magazines, some websites, and it just kind of grew. And then when I moved back to Boston, I was the staff writer at a paper called The Weekly Dig, and there was kind of like a collapse of ownership. The business, the owner is just kind of like a mess, and that job disappeared. And I was like, oh well, I've got plenty of time. Might as well propose a book. And so I wrote this book proposal and sent it in, and was shocked as hell when they were like, hey, we'll publish that. And it just kind of like stumbled into it.
Was that one of the old open submissions that they would do?
Yeah.
And how many proposals do they get during one of those cycles?
During that cycle, there were 600.
So I think I might have proposed right around the time that you did a book on Z by My Morning Jacket, and my buddy proposed an album on a Suzanne Vega album, and he and I like coached each other on how to do the proposal. And then I remember when you got it, and then that folded you into the whole. You're now part of like the 33 1/3 kind of like consortium now. You're part of their inner circle now, and they have like podcasts, and you guys are always hyping the next book. And so how many books now are there in the series?
I think we're at like 150, something like that. I have edited since I wrote my book. I've been on the selection committee, and I've been doing story editing, and I think I've done 8 books, including Janet Jackson, which is one of my absolute favorites of the series. And the Carole King, which was phenomenal. Wild Chupatulas, if you're familiar with them, it was Alan Toussaint and the Neville brothers.
T-Rex.
Yeah, he loves T-Rex.
It's
He
the
likes
Mardi
to
Gras,
bang
it's
it
the Mardi
on.
Gras album. The Wild Chapatulas is a Mardi Gras album. It's part of the culture of New Orleans and the dancing and the whole pageantry of carnival. So why should these young people who are listening to us have our little like friendly music fandom reunion on this call? Why should they're going to do it because they want to get a good grade in my class and it's like one of their major projects, but why should they want to write about these albums that they're going to write about? Like why, like thinking about it from our brief chats on Messenger over the last couple of months when I told you what I was trying to accomplish with this class, you immediately endorsed this idea of asking them all to write an album paper. So they're not going to write a book. They're not going to write a book. They're not even going to write a chapter of a book. They're going to write like an abstract, you know, a 1,000-word abstract on an album. So why should they be excited about doing this job?
I mean, I think that whenever you dive headlong into, you know, your favorite records, you're diving headlong into your own soul. You know, a lot of 33 1/3 proposals are explicitly autobiographical, and I avoided that. I consciously avoided that and subconsciously ended up writing a very autobiographical book. And nobody else would know, but I know. And that's kind of weird. And I think that, like, you know, I think when you're doing it professionally, sometimes there's just like a mercenary aspect where you've got to write about the record and tell your audience about it. Because that's the assignment and you need to cash a check. But I think on the best days, when you dive into an album, you're picking apart how you think about things, and you're crystallizing your own concepts of art, of life. You know, you're using you're using that moral compass to navigate the ineffable. And I think that, you know, in modern life, we don't spend a lot of time engaging the ineffable and the abstract and the kind of the deeper parts of human nature that that music can unlock. And I think when you engage with music critically and you know, with your whole kind of psyche in there, it produces some pretty marvelous results. You know, it's a form of meditation. It's a form of exploration. And, you know, the more you learn about music, the more you learn about yourself and what really, you know, matters to you. Like for instance, Seamus loves Into the Spider-Verse. So he, you know, he's always engaging with his sense of danger, but at the same time he's engaging with, you know, when he's engaging with hip hop and when he's engaging with, you know, graffiti culture, Seamus is, you know, extending himself beyond the walls of it, you know, his experience. And I think that applies to all of us. Like when we, you know, for one of the wild things about ending up in Nashville was that because I'm from the East Coast and I grew up with hip hop, when I ended up writing in Nashville, there was kind of this, you know, there was this chasm of coverage where, you know, we just weren't seeing local hip hop acts, and people, and so that became my niche. And so I had to, you know, every week I had to engage with a culture that is not necessarily my own. As much as I love hip hop, I am not I'm just a goofy white dude from the suburbs of Boston. So to engage the more serious ends of Southern hip hop, I really have to, go outside of my own expectations and my kind of own cultural mores to find out where the artistry is happening. Woo! And what that artistry will produce. And it's an amazing experience when Seamus, do you want a piece of paper to draw on? Here we go, bud. I mean, I think that like the more music you engage in or engage with, the broader your interest will become. Like there's a Minnie Riperton song called the deeper you go, the better it gets, which is not about record reviews, but you can, sort of imagine. But that's kind of like, that's how I've always approached writing about music, is when you really explore these kind of obscure corners of the culture. There's a lot that will make you rethink how you're, or will make you rethink your prejudices. You need to find a T-Rex. Will you settle for a raptor?
T-Rex.
Okay, buddy. And yeah, I think that like, the act is the act of reviewing or engaging with music is the act of engaging music is just an exercise in mind expansion.
So Sean, you could not have described my motives for this class better, or my intuitive understanding about why I can't give up, why I can't get out of the game, and why this hobby, I was going down in the early aughts, going down a totally different path with like, with activism and all this. And as soon as I started making enough money to afford to go to shows again and afford to buy music, because I went through a whole period in my 20s and 30s where I couldn't afford music. As soon as I could afford music.
Same again, here. That's why I started writing about music, is because then I didn't have to, I could feed my habit without any money.
Now that you pick your streaming client for $10 to $15 a month, you have a click. I mean, man, we scrounged just to get a record to listen to. I mean, we scrounged. We were like quarters out of the couch just to buy a CD. And now for $15 a month with a click, you can have the entire jukebox of the universe. So, Sean, I'm going to stop the recording so they can type questions in the chat, because we're gonna they get to log off in about 7 minutes. So. Everybody,
excellent.
This is Sean Maloney with his special guest, Seamus, live from the northeast of the Boston area. And I'm so grateful that you were able to come on the call today, Sean. I hope they got something out of it, but I certainly did. And I'm so grateful for our almost 20 years of friendship, my friend. Yeah, actually, exactly 20 years of friendship, which is insane.
Yeah.
Time flew by.
Right?